second, any second.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another installment of the Black Lives Matter. Oh my gosh, I messed it up. The Black Kids Can't Wait Facebook Live programming, where we are focused on finding resources and resolutions to shrink the academic education gap in LA Unified Schools that has been exacerbated by the pandemic, but was an ongoing problem due to racial bias, as a report came out last week. And we are addressing some of these situations or some of these topics in this series of shows. So welcome back. I am your host, Angel Tyree, and I am not hosting alone today. Once again, I have Renee Bailey with me, and we are going to just jump right into this topic here. This is a topic that we ran out of time on last week. We probably will run out of time on it this week, and then we'll open it up again in the next week. If you are following us live and you have questions or comments, please drop them in the chat, and we will try to address them if we can on this show. If you are not following live and you have questions, please drop them in the chat and someone will answer your questions or get back to you at a later date. We will try to address some of your questions or topics or concerns today during the live show. However, if we cannot, someone will absolutely reply to you, respond to you in the chat. So please share with your friends, like our page, come back again. We will be continuing this conversation again next week, I believe. No, the week after. But this is going to be a continued conversation. So join the conversation however you can, be it in a chat, be it in a share, be it in a conversation with your peeps about how you're going to address your schools and the district together. All right. So with that, I'm going to welcome Renee. Thank you, Renee, for being my co-host once again today.
Thank you so much for having me. So hello, I am Renee. I'm here with Speak Up. But in addition to being with Speak Up, I am a parent of two LAUSD students. So I have skin in the game. So this is something that I care about deeply. So as Angel said, this panel discussion is just a continued segment from our last panel, and everything is based off of our report, which was the impact of racial bias on Black students in LAUSD. So last week we discussed solutions that targeted school culture at different sites and what we need to teach our children or how we need to teach our children. Whereas this week, we're going to focus on how public policy can address systemic racism in our schools. So before we get into that, I want to introduce our guest, Dr. Laura McGowan Robinson. If you can introduce yourself and introduce the organization that you represent.
Hi, glad to be here. Thank you for having me. Like you said, my name is Laura McGowan Robinson. I'm the founder and CEO of Diversity and Leadership Institute. Our organization was founded to address the chronic racial diversity gap among educators of color and students in California. And we believe that not only should we have racial equity among our educational leaders, but we also should have cultural competence along with that, because it's just as important, if not more, to ensure that all of our leaders are culturally competent, culturally responsive leaders. And I think that gets to the issues that we'll be talking about today. So it's not just enough to be an educator of color, but we must be educators of color who are responsive to the needs of our students. Our work was birthed out of a study, Charting the Course to Equity, that looked at what educators of color specifically bring to the school setting, looking at educational outcomes produced when we have educators of color leading our schools, particularly Black and Latinx, looking at college going rates, looking at suspension and expulsion rates as well, and how that makes a difference in our schools. And so I'm looking forward to speaking with you all more about this very important topic today, and particularly how Diversity and Leadership Institute engages on this issue.
Perfect. Thank you for sharing that. I'm very interested to hear what you have to say. So Mike Bland, last but certainly not least, if you can introduce yourself and the organization that you represent.
Sure. Thank you. And thank you again for having me today. I am excited to have this conversation and join Dr. McGowan Robinson, Renee, and Angel. I think this is awesome. I'm the National Director for Leaders of Color, where we recruit and train Black and brown folks across the country to be political leaders and civic leaders. For far too long, decisions are being made in our communities that we are represented overwhelmingly, and we're not at the table. And so we feel like leaders of color, we need to develop leaders across the country to have a say. And so I'm excited to not only talk about this topic, but to talk about some of the major achievements that we can still accomplish and how we can help our Black and brown kids across the country. And it's important to have folks that look like them at the seat,
Yes.
right? And so let's jump into it. I'm excited.
Well, before we jump into it, I am going to introduce a few slides from our study just to bring everybody in alignment on what we reported, and it's kind of based our conversation based around that. So here we go. All right, so we're going to talk about the impact of racial bias on Black students in LA Unified. This was a report that was produced by Speak Up, and it discusses how school culture affects Black student achievement and decisions about returning to campus during the pandemic. It shows that, on average, 3.4 times, on average, Black students were 3.4 times less likely to achieve proficiency. In math and than their other peers. The performance fit historical trends, which is not a good thing. The gap between Black and white student scores over the past 10 years ranged from 28% to 40%. And when you look at closing the gap, as Adriel mentioned earlier, it's at a rate of less than 1%. So the survey that was conducted by Speak Up, it surveyed over 500 parents about their educational experiences over the past year. Speak Up measured how their views towards public education changed during distance learning. The survey was conducted between March 18th and 23rd of 2021. And what they found was that 2 out of 3 Black parents agreed that institutional racism is built into our public education system, that nearly 60% of Black students agree that LAUSD does not provide Black students the same opportunities as white students. And only 24% of Latino parents and just 14% of white parents agreed with this statement. And when you look at this, fewer than Black parents, 58%, than Latino parents report that schools supported their child's racial identity. So when they looked at the parents that want to send their children back to school, they found that nearly 2 out of 3 Black parents said they didn't want to send their child back. And when they cited the reason, many cited COVID as a factor, but actually 43% of those respondents who kept their children at home said they were concerned about bullying, racism, and low academic standards for Black children. Also, Black parents were more likely than other groups to say their kids' educational experience, including behavior and support from teachers, improved during distance learning. So with that being said, all right, let's go ahead and start this conversation. How do you guys feel about some of those stats?
The first thing that comes to mind for me is, 2 things. One, this is a study that's based here in LA Unified School District. But what we know is that this is not exclusive to LA Unified School District. This is a nationwide problem. As we know, a report very similar to this came out in New York a couple of weeks ago. So then it brings me to my really big one right off the rip is, how have these districts been able to get away with these disparities in education for so long? Because these reports, in doing preparation for the show, I start seeing these reports that date back to, dare I say, back when I was in school in the 70s, that are all the same though. They're saying the academic achievement gaps are not closing. They're, closing at the rate of less than 1% over a decade. Like, how are districts able to get away with this? That's my question. I told you I don't have answers, just questions.
So, Dr. Laura, when you hear this, how do you feel? What do you say? Because I know that Black leadership is important in schools, but how do you think that plays a part in some of the findings in Speak Up's report?
Yeah, and one thing that I go back to is kind of my own experiences in school, and what made my schooling, what made my school a welcoming environment for me, what made my school a welcoming environment for my mother, and what did she have to do in some cases to demand that welcoming environment if it wasn't achieved. And I think to your point, Angel, this conversation has been happening for decades, centuries, might I argue. Black parents have been coming to their districts or public education entities and asking for access, demanding access. And so often we're overlooked, but in a lot of cases, we create our own institutions, our own culturally affirming environments. And when I think about the role that Black educators play and have played historically in creating affirming environments for our students, it dates back to when it was illegal for us to read. And so I'm thinking, how can we do a better job of recruiting and retaining Black educators who can help lean in on this issue, but also the work that Speak Up is doing in terms of parent advocacy. How are we demanding that these institutions that we pay our tax dollars to serve our kids, and not just adequately serve them, but serve them exceptionally, because we deserve it, right? And so I would say, like, one, parent advocacy is critical. Two, ensuring that we have leaders and educators in front of our students who can affirm them. And three, as I think about folks who are jumping into this racial equity space and want to be allies and co-conspirators, how are you leveraging your power to ensure that we are getting the outcomes and working in community with, not doing it on behalf of, but how are you working in community with Black families and students to achieve this type of outcomes that our students are very well capable of? This isn't a matter of whether or not our students are brilliant. They're brilliant. They bring their brilliance to the door. But how are you as educators cultivating that brilliance? How are you tilling the soil? How are you sowing the seeds? How are you watering and ensuring that brilliance grows and takes root? So that's what I would say, how they've gotten away with it. These are the things that we need to do to demand that they no longer do that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Mr. Bland, do you have something to add to that? Looks like you want to jump in.
I have to reflect for myself and question, do I want to keep my job if you want a real answer? So too many folks are woke, and we didn't fall asleep. And so when I think of the pillars of our organization, one of them are accountability. And that's why people with lived experiences have to be at the table, right? And so when I think of this, I'm going to put a subtle plug about Leaders of Color. That's why we started Leaders of Color, because we were looking for the people who were in the community, who knew the community. When we think of folks like Shalia Harris in Memphis, Tennessee, she unseated a gentleman who was in her district. It was a Trump +2 district, and she was a nonprofit. She started a nonprofit for homeless youth in Memphis, Tennessee. And now when she's going in with her hair on fire and invoking change immediately, it's because she's had lived experiences and she knows the experiences, she knows the community. And then when I reflect and when I hear you talk about the lack of accountability, I think about James Baldwin, right? It was so cool to tweet and to share James Baldwin and say what it was like to be a Negro. And you told my parents I'm 60 years old. And you told them 60 years ago that they should wait. And so now we no longer want to wait. And so that's why we have to be, I tell folks, if you can't get hell-bent about the most important election of a lifetime, then we're losing. They're like, oh yeah, the president. I said, no, that's not the most important election. The most important election in your community is school board.
Yes.
These are the folks who are reforming that or forming the education for your children, right? The reason why I say more African American men need to get on school boards, right? Everybody wants to be a mayor and have an executive protection unit. I say no, serve on a school board. That's how we turn off the faucet to the school to prison pipeline. That's how now, when you look at little Billy, you look at John, and you say, you know what? You're right. Now I can see them not doing homework because they've been sitting at home with you for 14 months, right? And they don't understand. And so it's more than how we holding everybody accountable, because the concept of a village cannot just be in one community.
Absolutely.
Whole community. So it's really holistically taking an approach that how can the whole community be held accountable? Because the education community is the village. And so I think for far too long, we've put a Band-Aid. We let it be acceptable for our state and local governments to say the first thing we're going to cut is arts and education, but we'll give more money to overseas and the military. That should be unacceptable, what we call the greatest democracy in the world. where our kids are learning, where our kids aren't even in the top, our kids aren't even in the top 10. So I have a huge problem with that. So I'll stop because I'm not going to get on my soapbox and hog up all the time, because these are relative points. And you said, Angel, back in the 70s, it's crazy because when I was in school, and I said this to a couple friends the other day, I said, when I was in school, and it wasn't, probably about 20 years ago, but when I was in elementary school 25, 30 years ago, there are still 5 people on the Board of Ed that were on the Board of Ed then.
Yes.
Transformational change. Where are the new thinkers? You mean to tell me those are the only people that could sit and really think about the future for our children? No, that's why we need young, bright, sharp, and intuitive minds. That's why we need to be recruiting, not for the White House, but for the school board. But I'll digress.
No. Actually, you bring up a very good point, because I wanted to bring up the statistic that says in California, less than 50% of classrooms are led by African-American teachers, and more than 100,000 Black students are in schools without any African-American teachers at all. So, I mean, when I hear what you guys are talking about, can we just talk about how important it is for our children to see teachers who look like us?
Absolutely. I'm going to go back to a study that was really the impetus for the work of the Diversity and Leadership Institute. The Charting a Course to Equity study looked at the impact of Black and Brown leadership on student outcomes. And specifically, we found that Black high school students saw double-digit increases in math and ELA when they were at a school led by a Black or Brown principal. And not just Black students, but there were significant increases for Latinx students and for all students, regardless of race. So all students benefit when we have Black teachers in our classrooms, Black educators leading our schools. In addition to that, we saw as much as 50% decrease in suspensions for African-American students. In the state of California, regardless of whether or not you were in a charter school or a district school, there was a decrease, significant decrease in suspensions across the board, regardless of race, when we had a principal of color in the leadership seat. Additionally, A through G completion rates flew up when we had representative leadership, leaders of color leading these schools. And so the data, it bears this out, right? It's racial diversity matters. Culturally responsive school leadership matters. And so why aren't we putting policy in place that ensures that all students, whether they're Black, whether they're Brown, because now we know, and we also know that if our Black students are achieving, everyone is achieving, right? Everyone is succeeding. So the data shows us this, right? So how are we holding our leaders accountable? How are we holding our school board members accountable for putting policy in place to ensure that we are recruiting and retaining? How are we holding our legislators accountable for because if the data is saying this, we aren't making this up. This isn't a hunch. And I didn't need that study to prove that to me. As a principal, as a former principal, I've seen it. I know principals who've witnessed this themselves, right? But so often we are put upon, we're burnt out because we are carrying this torch. We're burning the candle at both ends. And we need a community of support to advocate for these leaders who are in these seats, who often feel isolated and alone. And when they are disrupted, when they are pushing, then they are put in the position to potentially lose their jobs, right? So how are we ensuring that these policies are upheld so that when these folks are doing what they're supposed to be doing and pushing back, that they don't fall prey to the system that they're trying to push against?
Absolutely. Thank you so much. So, I'm going to throw something out here when we talk about public policy. So LAUSD is receiving a massive influx of COVID dollars that they are dedicating $375 million to serve Black students. In addition to that, $36.5 million, the board voted earlier this year to divert those funds to Black student achievement. So we always hear about money being thrown at the problem. That's often. But let's talk about, instead of throwing money at the problem, how can public policy change things for Black students in public education? Michael, you want to take that? Mike, you want to take that question?
Yeah, no problem. Look, I think this is a simple answer. Folks will say, right? I mean, give us the 300. No, I'm just joking. What I think, again, it goes back to having people with lived experiences at the table and building policy. I often say, and people fight back with me, I said the reason why Hillary Clinton didn't win was because Donald Trump with this, and the gasoline was thrown on hatred and racism. I said, because we talked about policy. Folks want to hear about lived experiences. You talked about why it was so important that you have Black teachers and Black principals. I was privileged. And I know it sounds crazy hearing a Black man talk about he was privileged. I was privileged. And I can't say it is. I can't say, I mean, the school system I grew up in is the same way now. But I was with my 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade teachers were African-American males and females. My elementary school principal was an African-American male who taught me the sport of track, who taught me how to tie a tie, stand up straight. Every Friday there was a group for the struggling young Black men academically called Pride. And we weren't struggling academically. We just didn't have anybody at home. See, that's another touch point, right? Why it's so important to have lived experiences in a classroom. Okay, Mike doesn't have his head down because he has a headache. Mike has his head down because he's hungry. Mike has his head down because mom and dad are arguing at home because they're still trying to figure out how to rub $2 into a nickel, right? I mean, 2 nickels into a dollar, right? They're struggling. How do we figure out a plan? We don't have a plan for rent. How do I got a plan for college? And so he has to hear that. And so how does the school system divert and say, again, we're talking about that village approach and having people who have these lived experiences come to the table. Who are you going to be forthright and saying, okay, I often say, stop saying we need to have a task force. You don't need to have a task force. Put people who have lived experiences at the table. Stop saying, well, there are food deserts and we're going to do research. For what? Build a grocery store. We need our kids to go to college. Put them on a track. College is not built for everybody. So then put more money in vocational education and stop saying college is not for everybody. When we have the legacy preference and we keep sending the white boys to college. See, I told y'all going to get me fired today. Right. But these are things that are the issues, the issues in our communities when these scarcities of dollars are thrown around and say, now what do you do? Because, we're going to build a rec center. No. How do we make let's put broadband in African-American homes. What are we going to do? African-American and Latino homes. What are we going to do? Right? How are we going to increase our reading levels? What does reading look like? I don't want to get into an argument about critical race theory. I just want you to teach history. And that's, as my pastor would say, that's a word. So when we start to think about school suspension rates, right? Why? Well, I saw Chicago, and I think some schools in California started doing it. Why are we suspending schools? In the woke culture, I want somebody to wake up and say, stop using the word detention because detention means detained. So stop detaining our kids and send them to detention or suspend them from school or putting a resource officer in there with handcuffs. It's like, so to me, it's how are we building these channels of research? If we know as educators the path, what it took to get to college, we have to go back to, okay, this child needs to be at 3rd grade. How do we put them in a situation where they can be successful? Stop saying our kids don't know what they want to be, because I see everybody and their mother who are doing this on the first day of preschool, 2nd grade, 3rd grade. About your child knows what they want to be. So start having. That's what parent-teacher conferences need to be different. Don't give me a Monday update on how my child's doing. Tell me how I can put them on a path to success, and then let's start to have career day in the 3rd grade, not to high school. Let's give those mentorships. Stop saying that kid has to be mentored in the when he's 16 years old in high school. Put that 3rd grader around an investment banker at 7 years old, at 8 years old. Put him around, let him ride in the front seat of a police officer. So then he doesn't get that image that he's behind an officer. He's standing next to an officer. So we can inoculate that image. That's how we share those shared resources in the community. That's how we have a village approach. Regardless of we need more programs, or we're just going to add more resources, then what do they look like? And I think we have to ask the tough questions. That's why I say the people with lived experiences have to be at the table.
And
okay.
if I could just tag on to that. Yeah, and I completely agree. I mean, and Brian Stevenson talks about being proximate. Like, who are the people, right? Who are the people who are most proximate? And I'm thinking about, and through the lens of culturally responsive school leadership, it's about bringing down that fourth wall of the school and opening it up to the community. You shouldn't have to leave your community to be great. We can show our students the brilliance, the gifts, the talents that reside in their own neighborhood. Why aren't we bringing the local barbershop owner to talk about his entrepreneurship journey? Why aren't we talking to the nail tech who owns the nail salon down the street? There are things. Why aren't we talking to the restaurateur who is bringing in all of this wonderful capital right down the street and who is reinvesting it into the community? So it's about seeing the schools as a part of the community and not seeing parents as adversaries, but seeing parents as partners in the community, with the community. And so how can we as leaders, as principals in the classroom, as educators, bring that culturally responsive approach beyond the pedagogy, but in our practice?
I just add one more caveat to that. And you said, Doctor, you struck a chord, you almost lit a match. Because it's almost, what is that child? Okay, you're giving me $375 million. What is that? Have we ever thought about what does that child see on the bus route or walking to school? Give them that visualization of, if they don't have to walk through are they walking through the project? Are they walking through community stores? Are they walking, what are they seeing? How are they being encouraged in the morning? That's the dollars I want. That's when you talk about a community approach, a village approach, those revitalization of dollars. So now we're saying we have this one bucket from the state. So now we're saying, okay, the feds, give me those brownfields remediation dollars so I can remediate so we can remediate the neighborhood. So we can show our kids that Black and brown folks can be homeowners. So we can see they can be small business owners. Like you said, the barber is still a small business owner. Last time I checked, they're doing really good. That's a profession that's been here before time, right? So the barber, the chef, and I look and I say, my God, my kids see all of this all the time. The photographer that not only captures pictures, but they capture moments. So they see this every day as they're walking to school. So it's a different kind of encouragement. It's a different kind of enlightenment. So it's more than just a piece of a program. It's a holistic approach. And that's, again, you hear me say this. This is why it takes the village and people with the lived experiences at the table.
I'm going to bring up one good point. I hate to bring this up because, gentrification is a big thing. But Dr. Lori, because you live in West Adams, my neighborhood. I live in View Park. And I bring that up because when you look at the wealthiest communities in America and in the US for African Americans, View Park is number one. And when you look in this community, it's nothing but Black homeowners, Black professionals, a fire captain across the street, the producer for The Voice on the other side of the street. In fact, one of our board members is 2 blocks away from me. And it's interesting. You would think that our schools would come into this community and ask us, the people over here, to help out, because this is a huge example of Black excellence. And unfortunately, what's going on in this community is that since no one tries to reach out, a lot of families in this community have to bus their kids way to the west side in order to ensure our kids are getting a decent education. And it's a terrible thing when there's so much Black excellence right here. And across behind me, you got Baldwin Hills, and down the street, you have Ladera. But hey, so.
Mike made a really great point earlier, and it was something that, I wanted to talk about today, and it's about the whole student. So, I think sometimes when parents, community, we think about and we talk about, inequities in education in our public school systems, we're really focused on, did, Billy get an A, B, or C, but not looking at all the reasons why Billy may have gotten an A, B, C, or F, right? And there's all of these factors that come into play as to taking care of the whole student so that student can be successful. I had an experience. I taught for one sole year third grade. And I remember I got put in a really tough classroom. It was not here in LA, it was back in Ohio, but I remember having a kid who had his coat. It's winter, so you might have on a coat because the school may or may not have heat at any given time. And so, but he had on this hood and he had his head down almost the whole day. And I'm like, what is going on? And I came by and I just like sort of touched him and I asked him to sit up. And he had an explosion of all the things that happened at home that night, why he didn't sleep, why he needed to sleep now, and what he's worried about in going home. And I think that was my first, even as an educator coming from the same neighborhood, I think it was my first real sort of understanding that if the whole kid is not taken care of, we're not going to get the A's and B's, maybe even not the C's, maybe even not a D, because there's something else blocking this child from being able to access the curriculum like we like to talk about. But it's not because he can't grasp the concepts. It's because there's a whole lot of life happening around, right? And so one of the things I would love to see the schools do, and I don't know if parents even know how to hold schools accountable for, is something that Mike brought up. Like, how do we look at the whole kid? How do we look at everything that they experienced on the way to school before they even got into that advisory classroom in the first thing in the morning? Like, what happened from leaving door to getting in that seat? And what are the experiences? And how does that factor into if this child can sit here and learn? Be it they're hungry, be it, they don't have a clean, clear walkway to school, their walkway. I remember being a child, second grade, being a latchkey kid walking to school, and I walked alone. There was no one on my path at the time. And I would be terrified at the slightest noises and sounds, that my anxiety is up here by the time I get to school. I was able to learn how to persevere and get through and get the grades, but understanding all of that is part of the whole package. And I think when we can start to look at the whole kid, the whole community, then we can start to reshape education. But how do we get our community, our parents, our educators to see that getting the A's and B's is not about can you grasp the concepts? It's about a whole lot of other factors that come into play before we get to can you grasp the concepts? So Absolutely. I would like to have a dialogue about how do we address that and how do we bring that to our districts? And I know, because I did ask a question about our board here not long ago, because it's sorely lacking in representation. But yeah, I just want to talk about that a little bit. How do we address that as a community, as parents, and then, go to our schools and our district to say we're not taking care of A's and B's. We're taking care of little humans.
I think that's right. And look, I'm fortunate to know that, my wife is a preschool teacher. And I am someone who, even before then, was adamant about the importance of pre-K. And I'm glad to hear President Joe Biden and Vice President, subtle plug to California, Vice President Kamala Harris say, universal pre-K should be the law of the land. And it's the first step of inequity. Now, I'll tell you where I'm going here, because we're, the little, the boys who live in the suburban communities or those of us who are well off, we send our kids to Garter school, a Montessori, or private school. Now, if y'all like some of the kids I know, majority of kids I know, they're going to Big Mama's house where they're watching Sesame Street and they're doing math, counting pennies out of our little coin jar. That's how they were doing their homework. That before they were kindergarten. So we have a step of inequity. But how do we get the community involved? How do we develop this concept of community relations, real community relations in a school? Is respect for teachers. First step is equitable pay. Our teachers should not nearly have to ever work in the summer. Folks make this joke, teachers have a good job and they have summers off. I said, do you know what it's like to be a teacher? You're not a teacher, you're a social worker, you're a mentor, you're a psychologist, you're the doctor, you're the nurse, right? So you're not just coming home with just, I'm just coming home. Dr. Robinson, she just wasn't coming home to herself. She was coming home with the burden of her whole school, right? Angel, you were coming home with the burden of all your students. When he lashed out and exploded, God only knows what was going on. So a different built-in respect for our teachers. And they need to be valued all year long in our communities. and they need to be supported. So stop arguing with your teachers and saying Billy wasn't wrong or they have it out for my child. I'm not going to say that doesn't exist, but do you really think somebody wakes up how about you identify that maybe your child is not as respectful as you think he is? Or how about this? You know your child's not respectful. And having that conversation that when you leave my house, you represent us. And how dare you disrespect X said teacher? So to me, how do we build this dialogue beyond the accountability of grades? It starts at the root, which who is feeding that root is the teacher, the administrator, the janitor, the gym coach, right? Because when we even start to think and quantify, teachers spend more time with your child than you will. Mm-hmm. Let them even play a sport. They will spend almost 10 hours in that building with that teacher that is just the basketball coach or the gym teacher. I guarantee that gym teacher knows more about you because your child is sitting there. So to me, it's about learning to put respect for the teacher. And then the second part is, it's having respect for career development. Having respect for career development. Mike, what do you mean? We have to show our kids all the options and saying the first step of success is teaching and learning, right? And sometimes you got to tell that AAU coach, you need to tell that Pop Warner coach, AYF coach, trust me, not only do I know him, I was one of them. Put the ball down and put a book in his hand. You can't see your way through graduation. And I'm not talking about visually. You can't see your way through graduation because I don't know how many colleges and universities are you're going to have the ability to see your way through. And that's when you tell me it's unacceptable to bring us in having these real conversations. No, I don't want to listen to rap music. I want to hear you recite Langston Hughes. I want to hear you recite James Baldwin, the great late Maya Angelou. I want to, tell me what the Reconstruction period is like. Because if our kids understood what Reconstruction was, or if our educators understood Reconstruction was, they would understand that we're at the exact same moment right now. And that's why I call this period Reconstruction 2.0. The litmus test of American democracy and education is right now. So that's why I think the dialogue on how we further our space and further our place in education happens. And to me, it's the accountability, the holistic accountability, and not just throwing scarcities of dollars around where we think things make sense or living in the land we're about to do, and being intentional about watering our roots and not thinking about what kind of water we have to put in them. Either way, water, right, grows our plants.
Right. So here's the question. I want to throw this out. We had a audience member ask a question I think I want to bring to you guys. And the question is, what is our thought on vocational classes in which our children can graduate with plumbing, electrical, carpentry certifications as in the past? Because too many of our Black students are going to college and coming out with loans in the thousands versus vocational children who have necessary skill sets and they're loan free.
I really want to jump in there, but I see Mike has something. I'm going to let Mike go first.
Y'all are going to get me fired. But I'm glad that even my boss, a Black man, will appreciate this. And we talk about this. There was this space right after the 60s or 80s where we thought not the colleges weren't filling up. Rooms weren't filling up. And then this thing about college was so important. But what thrived, what made the Black middle class was vocation. And so why do we take it out? How do we then, and the study was right. To me, the middle class, the reason why we have an absent middle class, because there's not a pathway to the middle class, which is vocation. Because you know what? You're right. Folks say not everybody has to go to college. Not everybody has not to have an opportunity. So we have to, again, give our kids those opportunities. Why does it cost so much for a kid to have an apprenticeship? In New Jersey, I think it's almost upwards of $15,000 for a kid to go to beautician. Like, that's insane. They don't have that money. So again, we're talking about inequities, that economic inequities, that there's the lack of stimulation in our education system. Right. And so when folks, whether it was carpentry, whether it was plumbing, these are jobs. And if you go to places, and the great example, I think they're doing an awesome example of this in the state of Connecticut. There are kids who are starting this as freshmen in high school and then going on graduating with a certificate. And as a freshman, y'all will appreciate this, making nearly $80,000 because a pathway to economic opportunity. And so if this is not on the agenda in our educational systems, we are lacking, and we have to we call out redlining, we call out education inequities, but then let's really roll the tape and talk about critical race theory. Let's ask the question, why did we take out the wood shops? Why did we take out the plumbing? Why did we take out sewing? Why did we take out auto mechanic school? Why did we take these things out of school when the Black middle class was thriving when they knew this? I'm sorry, doctor. I'm sorry. You know, how many of us still have uncles? We had uncles when I was growing up. Everybody's uncles knew how to fix a car because they took that class in school. Now I'm like, now I gotta go to the dealership, right? So that hence is part of the problem.
So how can public policy change that and improve that, Dr. Laura?
I'm thinking about career pathways. I'm thinking about access to vocational school, making sure that the dollars that we're getting from COVID is reinvested into these programs that have been sunset. I think it's not about. I think the policies are there. I think the funding was dried up, right? I think that it's really about reinstituting those things and us demanding that. I think for a while people were like, oh, well, we don't need that. We're going to go. And I must say, and I think, Mike, you hit on this. For my child, I want him, even if he decides not to go to college, that he makes sure that he has his A through G requirements. And if he decides that he wants to go to the vocation route, he has that option. I want the options to be endless for my son, Jordan. I want him to be able to pick whatever road he wants to go down and be able to do that. But in terms of public policy, we have to demand that those funds be reinvested into those programs that were dried up. So I don't have anything else to add to what Mike said. I think he dropped the mic on that
one. Mike dropped the mic on that one. He totally did. I'm an advocate for vocational programs. I don't understand why there aren't more of them. When I was in school, we had options to go while we were in high school to take vocational programs. So when you graduated, whether you were going on to college or not, you were certified in something. You had a skill set. If it's one thing my dad told me is you better have some skills to do some things, whether you have a degree or not, because sometimes you might not be able to get that job. But if you have some skill sets, you can go do that and supplement your income until you're back on track. I think there's nothing wrong with having skill sets, be it a plumber, be it an electrician, be it a mechanic. I think there's nothing wrong with having that in addition to if you are going to be college degreed. I am college degreed, but you best believe I know how to use some tools. If it's an old school car, I can get up under it and fix it. These new ones, not so much. But like you got to have some skills. And I think that my dad was a middle class worker, so he understood that. He was not college degree. And I think that we did lose that somewhere along the lines that these vocational skills are good skill sets to have. You know, we see the barber and we think, oh, I don't want to be a barber, but some of the barbers I grew up have multiple shops. You know, they have made very good livings. And so, you know, we have to see bigger vision in vocational skills. And I think you're so right. We will see, you know, 80 grand a year is better than no grand a year.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely.
Don't I know? But when you said it, I mean, to cap off what you said, yeah, how does this affect public policy? It affects public policy because who are the policymakers? Again, having these lived experiences at the table. So if we're talking about vocational schools and putting the funding in, you know, to have the 80-year-old white guy who would argue that we needed to take vocational school out to have for our kids to study Plato and Machiavelli, you know, or to have a level of an acronym in science so we can understand granite and that. Well, stop, time out. That's not what I want to study. Why am I wasting 45 minutes 3 times a day, almost 48 weeks a year studying granite when I could be studying how to cut hair, when I own multiple barber shops, which means I own multiple properties, which means I have multiple influence. And that's why I say even to this day, I used to use the example of Congresswoman Jahana Hayes because I ran her first campaign. But now even thinking about Shalia Harris, who was a former teacher, now school board commissioner, That's why teachers need to be at the table. That's why there's something to be said that why can't teachers why can't they sit on school boards? Why can't they speak up at school board meetings and say, because they can't do it because of fear of their job? That's a problem.
And fear of their unions as well.
Oh, no.
We ain't trying to have the show shut down, but let's make sure we bring that up. But anyway.
We won't be the Russians. We won't be the Russians.
So, I want to ask a question, like, I know that Leaders of Color is your initiative. Can you talk about like how your initiative can increase Black mobility and address the problems of systemic racism in public education?
Sure. First thing I'd say funding. we all need more funding, right? We all want folks to invest, but no, seriously, I think it's Leaders of Color came out of a concept because we saw multiple times we saw the level of inequity on steroids. And you have, if you can look at, like I said, your school boards, your city councils, and then you look at your activists, they're only taking a piece of the problem, or when they identify the problem, they don't even know where to go. So Leaders of Color is a concept grown out of what I think organically can be more. It's folks coming together with a common cause that are saying, I don't know how to start a campaign, not just politically. How can I find out more? I don't know how to raise money. Yeah, I'm scared to pick up the phone and ask somebody for $100, but that same person scared to ask $100 for will be the same person to give you $100 to go out in the club. No, I need you to invest, not donate. I need you to invest in our communities. So having these conversations with like-minded individuals, with the nonprofit leaders, with the small business owners, with clergy, with retired teachers, with young leaders, up-and-coming leaders, empowering those around us to say, you know what, let's sit together. Let's not live in a land of about to do and think about a solution. Let's sit out here and draw out our 5 major goals and concepts that we want to accomplish within the next 3 years. Here are the folks that we want to get elected. Here's why. Here's how we do it. And being forthright and intentional about a means to an ends of this unjust educational system. And so to me, it's empowering. It's us having this dialogue and saying, you know what, after this forum, after this panel, what do we have to do to put it in Oakland? What do we have to do to put it in LA? What do we have to do to put it in Atlanta? What do we have to do to put it in Seattle, Washington? What do we have to do to put it in Flint, in Detroit, Michigan? And folks say, well, I don't know if we should go there. There's a lot of politics there. So throw a wrench in it and break the machine. And so our civic leaders also need to understand that they're more than just advocating at a board meeting or a city council meeting. Oh, you think I'm a joke? Let me give you an example. I'm going to protest. We talk about economic inequity. I think it's almost 200 to 1, the gap of white wealth to Black wealth. So here's the example I'll get. I'll grab 1,000 white folks, and then I'll grab 10 Black folk, and we'll march into City Hall. So now you'll see a visualization of economic inequity. So just imagine if there was shared resources, because oftentimes people think African Americans and Latinos need a handout. They just come on, pick me up. Stop. Let's stop using this frame of resilience and pulling yourself up from your own bootstrap. I ain't got no boots, so where you want me to pull me up from my heels? I'm gonna fall right back on my back. Okay, if you give me the thread, and the needle, guess what? I'll go find some hide and make me a shoe. And don't worry, we've been doing it since we've been here. So this conversation of even reparations is crazy to say, oh, we have to wait. No, reparations should be in every inequitable form when it comes to housing, when it comes to education. It's a shame that we're still having this conversation about what's right or what's wrong. So Leaders of Color, we are adamant about making this change across the community. And I've used this frame so many times. I don't live in a land of about to do. I don't want to sit in a meeting and opine. I think we do that too much. Let's have 30 minutes or 45 minutes of action items. Okay, this is your job. Go do it. And that's how Leaders of Color across the country, that's how we've started to invoke change in Memphis. That's how we've started to invoke change in New York City. That's how we started to invoke change in New Orleans. And as we keep growing, this is how we're going to do it across the country, right? And so we're going to give people the tools and the skills in leadership, advocacy, and political acronym to be successful. And the last thing I'll leave you with is, oftentimes folks get this thing called the Strength Finder in college or a master's course. Why aren't we giving this tool to folks when they're freshmen in high school, when they're freshmen in college, so they identify their strengths and their weaknesses? Why aren't we doing this then? Why are we waiting? right? And so we are intentional about giving all these tools to our fellows and finding their strengths and weaknesses and putting them in a toolbox and sharpening those tools so we could be the change that we believe in.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, Dr. Laura McGowan Robinson, I want to ask one quick question for you. So, how can public policy increase the pipeline for leadership diversity in public education?
Right now, there's been a bill introduced in California, AB 520, sponsored by Mike Gibson, and also supported by State Superintendent of Public Education, Tony Thurmond. It's a first step. This grant, this a block grant, would fund districts, charter organizations who are committing themselves to retaining educators of color in their schools and their systems, and committing to also sharing what comes out of those efforts. That is one public policy step that we've taken, and I'm proud to see on the table, and something that Diversity and Leadership Institute is supporting. We have a coalition of 13 organizations that just submitted a letter. That bill has moved through the Assembly, and now it is in the Senate, up at the Senate Ed Committee right now, and hopefully will be heard very soon. So we're really pushing for that. I think that the next step for something like that would be that bill focuses on teachers specifically. I think a good next step would be to focus on our leaders, because educators leave their bosses. And so how are we thinking about increasing not culturally responsive school leadership, cultural competency among our leaders, so that we can better retain our teachers, so that they want to stay in the profession, that they have a welcoming and warm environment, that they aren't pigeonholed into positions around discipline, that they don't get stuck in the pipeline as often Black aspiring principals do in the AP track and never moved up. So how are we thinking long term about the pipeline to increase Black principals in our state? But I'm proud to see that first step being taken, and that's one way that I see us on a trajectory to have racial equity among educational leadership, because at Diversity and Leadership Institute, we do believe that it is a lever to improve educational outcomes for students.
Perfect. You just gave me some game today. AB 520. I'm going to make sure that I research that. So the last question that I want to ask both of you, aside from attending school board meetings or contacting board members, what are other ways that parents and the community affect change at a policy level?
Happy to jump in on that. I think, as I'm thinking about the influx of money that is coming into our district, I'm thinking about accountability, and our parents demanding, because these dollars are expressly for Black students. So our Black parents, as I believe they are already doing, need to keep their foot on the gas and demand that they're very clear and transparent about what accountability looks like. With the new superintendent that will be coming into LAUSD, how are they ensuring that kids have before them educators of color? How are they ensuring that they have these wraparound support services that we talked about, and that they are enlisting the support of the community to provide these services? Schools can't be everything to everybody, but there are people out there who provide those services so that our students can have what they need in order to be successful. So how are we also demanding that our kids get that wraparound support? How are we also, because another big thing, especially when it comes to Black parents, and this was in your report as well, being disrespected, being silenced or pushed aside. Like these dollars are going to our families. I'm here. I demand respect and I demand results. So how are we as parents ensuring that we are heard and seen, and that we are getting the results for our students that they deserve? So those are a few things that I would leave for our parents and the audience, thinking about how they can engage. Call your local board member. Ask them with their local district plan, what does the accountability look like there? How can I get engaged in this? How are you thinking about the needs of my child? Those are the types of conversations that our parents should be pushing for, given that these dollars are specifically earmarked for our children.
Absolutely. And when you say parents need to call members of the board, we need to make sure parents are voting for the right members on the board who's willing to listen to the parents. But I digress.
That part.
So
I love it. I'm going to add on to Dr. Laura is that when you are calling or when you are writing or when you are showing up, sometimes there is more power in numbers. So if you can rally some of the parents of your kids' friends to join you in that, I think that your voice has more weight in it than just your call alone. You can sometimes become that awful word or awful phrase that we've all heard when we come to the schools or whatever and advocate for our kids. It's the angry, you know the rest. But when you come as a group, a collective group, and also remember, I think we forget when our kids are in public school system that it's public school system, but we are paying in tax dollars for this public school system. So it's not free school. When you check your taxes, remember, you paid for that school too. And so you do have a right, not just as a parent, but as a paying customer to advocate for change, to ask for what you want, to demand what you want when you have to, because you have paid for this. You do pay taxes. You do pay for this school.
And keep coming back. I think about my mother. She was like that gnat at the dinner table that wouldn't go away. And that's what it required. She demanded it. She rallied people. And she was a working mom. She had lots of other things to do, but she was like, no. And it was to the point that the parents, the teachers, they hated to see my mama coming. But that was fine. My mother would call Jesse Jackson. She would call whoever she knew who had power to wield it and leverage it to get the results that she needed. And that's what it's going to require, sadly, that we have to do all that. But that is what is going to require now. And so that we don't have to keep doing this. So that we, to your very first question, Angel, why does this keep happening? So we can stop the cycle. This is what we need to do.
Right. So Mike, what's your answer to it? What can parents in the community do at a local level to affect policy change?
You know what I want to say? Run for something. Run for office. Get up. Everybody's tired. Everybody's tired. But I have a saying I say in my house. Everybody's tired, but everybody got a job. Everybody has a job. So when you see something, say something, then do something. Right? It didn't stop with Donald Trump. So let's stop this farce that, oh my God, he got me so angry and I went out and voted and stopped. And then we say, well, black folk got no power when they get elected. That's because we stop at the voting booth. You've got to sit with them. You've got to show them how to pass legislation. You got to say, that's what you want to pass? All right, I'm gonna go. We're gonna meet at the church. I'm gonna get the chicken. Miss Bessie up the street said she get the potato salad, and we'll get some soda so we can figure out how we pass meaningful legislation for our babies. And guess what? It is not a doctoral thesis in this legislation. It is not. So my theory is run for something. And then if you can't run for something, then organize, mobilize, and energize. Again, everybody is tired. But we can't stop breathing for our kids. We can't stop fighting for these black and brown babies who have the levels of inequities are at an all-time high. You know, I think in Memphis, only 8% of black and brown boys from grades 3 to 8 are grade proficient. Who's speaking up? Who's at the table? Who let that happen? And then we say, oh, well, you know, Mike thought he was all big and bad once he got to school. So vote him out. I'm sorry, we'll go golf him, but you know what? You're just not doing it for my kids. And so the kids in our community are the biggest investments. Why? Because they're the next doctors, they're the next teachers, they're the next lawyers, they're the next plumbers, they're the next electricians, they're the next seamstress. I can't find somebody. I don't know the last time I've seen the black cleaners. Right. And so like the people with lived experiences have to be at the table. You know, the same way we get up and watch the same way we'll get up and we used to watch Power, or the same way we make time for Power, our favorite Netflix series, or our favorite show on BT or on Come On, Y'all Come On Home With, but we love Tyler Perry too. Though you make out that same time to sit at that Board of Education meeting. Because guess what? They're passing packets out like this and say, we told you, but you weren't there, out of sight and out of mind. And then last thing is, don't ever let an advocate go by themselves. Because what they'll say is they'll look at you and they'll be like, man, ain't nobody with him. We're just going to keep letting him talk. But just imagine if now they had to sit there and wait for 3 hours. And again, and again, and again. Also, you thought this was a game. So, okay, now we're going to stand outside the Board of Ed office. Okay, so you thought this was a game. Watch this. Now we have all-time high turnout at the voting booth. No, we don't want that to be something that the Board of Ed talks about. We need that to be a resolution. Right? So holding all streams of accountability accountable from the local Board of Education to our state house. And so to me, that's why I'm so adamant, particularly in this space with leaders of color, particularly now when the levels of inequity the lights could not be flashing brighter and more consistent. And we're saying, well, what are we going to do? You know what the problem is. Get up and run for something. That's what I said.
Well, Renee, I'm on your team when you're ready to run for the board. We know who to call. We're going to call Mike. I got your back. I'm here for you. No, oh my goodness. This has been one amazing, fantastic, far overdue conversation. I thank you both for coming here and sharing lived experience, formal knowledge, passion. I thank you so much for being here with us. This conversation doesn't stop here. If you are watching live, or if you are just watching a replay, this conversation doesn't stop here. This is not the end. This is not over because it came to a conclusion. There is something left to do. There's a lot more left to do. And it cannot rest with inaction. There has to be activity. So it's just sort of a pep talk if you don't do something. And we're not really just giving pep talks. We really want some change to happen. So I'm turning it over to Renee to close, but thank you both for being here. Fantastic conversation.
So as we close it out, just want to mention to everyone watching, if you guys want to further the conversation, we have APAT, which is African American Parent Advocacy Team. If you want further information, be sure to email renee@speakupparents.org. In addition, I want to say thank you, Dr. Laura. Thank you, Mike, for coming on our show. And this wraps up Racial Bias Part 2. Thank you.